The Night Visitor of Regent Street, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. The Alarm on Regent Street. The fog had settled over London with the particular thickness that belongs to the last days of autumn, when the Thames breathes its damp exhalations over every rooftop, and the gas lamps along Regent Street burn like dull amber coins through the murk. Few souls stirred at that hour save the milk carts rattling over the cobbles and the occasional watchman making his weary rounds, and the street itself, so thronged and fashionable by day, wore instead the hushed and secretive aspect that London reserves for the small hours before dawn, when even its grandest thoroughfares seem to hold their breath. It was in such weather, at the unfashionable hour of 6 in the morning, that a young constable named Higgins first noticed that the shutters of Pemberton's horological emporium had not been raised. This was, in itself, a matter of no great significance. Shopkeepers are entitled to their lie-ins as much as any man, but Constable Higgins had walked this beat for 11 months, and in that time he had never known Josiah Pemberton, a man so punctual that the very clocks in his window seemed to take their cue from his footsteps, to open later than 6:30. By 7, when the shutters remained down and no light showed behind the glass, Higgins knocked. By 7:30, having received no answer, he fetched the shop's landlord, a portly wine merchant named Cobb, who kept a spare key against emergencies. The key turned in the lock without difficulty. That fact would later prove to be of the very first importance, though at the time it seemed merely to confirm that all was well within. All was not well within. Josiah Pemberton lay upon the floor of his workshop, amid the ruin of a dozen delicate mechanisms swept from his workbench in some final struggle, his skull broken by a blow delivered, so the police surgeon would shortly declare, with tremendous force from above and slightly behind. The workshop itself, a narrow chamber at the rear of the shop lined floor to ceiling with clocks of every description, presented an eerie tableau, for every timepiece in the room, without exception, showed the identical hour of 11 minutes past midnight, and every one of them had stopped. Constable Higgins, to his credit, touched nothing, but sent at once for Scotland Yard. The inspector who arrived, a sharp-featured, energetic man named Lestrade, well known to readers of these chronicles, surveyed the scene with the confidence of a man who believed the matter would resolve itself within the day. The shop door had been locked from the inside, the bolt drawn and the key still in it. The single window, high and barred with iron, had not been disturbed, its dust undisturbed upon the sill. There was no other means of entrance to the workshop save through the front of the shop itself, which in turn could be reached only by the street door, locked, or by a private stair connecting to Pemberton's lodgings above, which his housekeeper swore upon her soul had remained bolted the whole night through, as was her nightly habit, to test with her own hand before retiring. Cobb the wine merchant, having surrendered his key and his composure in nearly equal measure, retreated to the pavement, and stood there a long while, hat in hand, muttering that he had known Pemberton 12 years, and never once heard him raise his voice, as though the very mildness of the dead man's temper made the violence done him somehow the more monstrous. A crowd gathered with the swiftness peculiar to London tragedies, drawn by nothing more than the sight of a police whistle and a closed shop, and Higgins found himself obliged to plant his broad back against the door and turn away a dozen idle questions before the first plainclothes men arrived to relieve him of the duty. Lestrade, for his part, moved through the small crowded shop front, with the brisk satisfaction of a man already composing his report, pausing only to instruct a constable to keep the milliner's boy from the window opposite, whose face had pressed itself flat against the glass in frank and unashamed curiosity. He noted the hour, the state of the bolt, the undisturbed dust upon the sill, and pronounced, before the police surgeon had so much as knelt beside the body, that the matter wanted only the discovery of whichever ruffian possessed a grudge and a key. Here, then, was a puzzle worthy of the name, a man murdered in a room sealed as securely as a strong-box, with no visible means by which his killer might have entered or departed, It was Isabella Pemberton, the dead man's only child, who first thought to send for Sherlock Holmes. She had read, as had half of London, the account of the Baskerville affair, and she reasoned, correctly as it happened, that where Scotland Yard's methods failed, a keener eye might yet succeed. She dispatched a note to Baker Street within the hour, before the body had even been removed, describing the circumstances in a hand that trembled only slightly, and begging that Mr. Holmes attend upon her at his earliest convenience, for she feared, though she could not say precisely why, that the official verdict of accident or robbery gone wrong would prove a grave injustice to someone she loved. She did not, in that first letter, name whom she meant, but her fear, as I would soon learn, centred upon a young man named Nathaniel Croft, her father's apprentice of 6 years' standing, to whom she had been secretly engaged for the better part of one, and who had been discovered, not 2 hours after the body was found, with a smear of dried blood upon his shirt cuff, and no satisfactory account of where he had passed the small hours of the night. The engagement, kept from Josiah Pemberton until such time as Croft might present himself with sufficient prospects to be received rather than dismissed, had been a source of quiet joy to Isabella and quiet anxiety to Croft in equal measure, for the old clockmaker was known among his fellow tradesmen as a man of exacting standards, unbending in matters of business, and only a little less so in matters of the heart. That this same private hesitation should now be twisted by the cruel arithmetic of circumstance into a motive for murder was a thought Isabella could scarcely bring herself to entertain, and yet the constables who had searched Croft's lodgings that same grey morning had returned with expressions that told her, more plainly than any words, which direction their suspicions had already begun to run. Such was the state of affairs when Holmes and I first heard the particulars, over a breakfast that neither of us, as matters transpired, would be permitted to finish in peace. Chapter 2. A singular client at Baker Street. I had risen later than my custom that morning, the autumn chill having settled into my old wound with its usual complaint, and I found Holmes already dressed and standing at our window in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, a letter in his long fingers, and an expression upon his face that I had learned, over the years of our association, to recognise as the particular pleasure he took in a problem promising complexity. "Watson," said he, without turning, "you are about to meet a young woman whose composure will impress you a great deal more than her account of the facts, which I confess strikes me as thin in exactly the places where I should wish it thickest. You have had a letter, then?" "I have had 2. The first from a Miss Isabella Pemberton, whose father was found murdered in Regent Street, in circumstances that Lestrade, for it is Lestrade who has the case, describes in a telegram as impossible but not for long. The second, and here he permitted himself a thin smile, is from Lestrade himself, informing me that my services will not be required, as the matter is as good as settled. You will observe, Watson, that whenever a policeman assures me a case is settled, I have generally found it wisest to begin packing my lens and my tape measure." He had scarcely finished speaking when Mrs. Hudson announced the lady herself, and I confess that my first sight of Isabella Pemberton confirmed every word Holmes had said of her composure. She was perhaps 24, dressed in unrelieved black that had plainly been assembled in haste, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her voice steady, even as she recounted, in careful and orderly fashion, the discovery of her father's body, the locked room, the stopped clocks, and, with evident reluctance, the blood upon Nathaniel Croft's cuff. She spoke, too, of her father's final days, his habit of retiring to the workshop after the shop had closed for business, the light beneath the door that burned later each week, and a certain restlessness in his manner that she had put down, until now, to nothing more sinister than the ordinary preoccupations of a man absorbed in his craft. It was only in the telling, she confessed, that she had begun to wonder whether some deeper trouble had lain beneath her father's distraction, a trouble he had kept from her out of the same protective instinct that had, perhaps, cost him his life. "You believe him innocent," said Holmes when she had finished, though it was not truly a question. "I know him innocent, Mr. Holmes, as surely as I know my own heart. But knowledge and proof are different currencies, and I have only the one to offer Inspector Lestrade, who deals exclusively in the other." "And how does Mr. Croft himself account for the blood, and for his movements in the night?" A flicker of pain crossed her composed features. "He says he cannot account for either, that he woke in his lodgings near Seven Dials, with the blood already upon him, and no memory of how the hours had passed since he left my father's shop the previous evening at 9 o'clock, sober and in good humour. He does not ask me to believe an easy story, Mr. Holmes. He offers only an honest one, which is why I believe it." Holmes questioned her closely upon the character of the household, the housekeeper's habits, the hours kept by Croft, the frequency of visitors to the shop in recent weeks, and I observed, as I had observed 100 times before, how skillfully he drew from a witness details she had not thought worth the telling. It emerged that Pemberton had, in recent months, kept later hours than his custom, remaining at his workbench until well past midnight on occasion, a habit his daughter had attributed to some particularly delicate commission, though he had grown strangely reticent upon the subject whenever she inquired, turning the conversation aside with a briskness quite unlike his usual openness with her. Holmes regarded her in silence for a long moment, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. Then, in the manner I had come to know so well, he turned abruptly from the matter at hand. "You have travelled here by the Metropolitan Railway, changing at Baker Street Station itself, and before that you called at your father's bank, where you were kept waiting some considerable time in a chair beside a coal fire." Miss Pemberton started visibly. "How could you possibly? The cinder dust upon the hem of your left boot is peculiar to the Metropolitan line's tunnels near this station, and no other. The faint scorch mark upon your glove, just at the thumb, comes from having held it too near a fire while distracted, a common habit among those kept waiting upon business they would rather not attend to. And the ink smudge upon your right forefinger, still fresh, suggests you have this morning signed some document of consequence, a bank's transfer form, most probably, given the hour and the season of grief in which such matters press upon a family." He paused. "I mention this only to demonstrate, Miss Pemberton, that small signs, properly read, tell a truthful story where a man's own words might mislead, a principle that will serve us well in the matter of your father's death, and Mr. Croft's cuff." It was, I thought, exactly the demonstration the lady needed, for her shoulders eased fractionally, as though she had been granted permission to hope. "Then you will take the case?" "I had already taken it," said Holmes, rising to reach for his coat, the moment Lestrade told me it required no taking. "Watson, if you would be so good as to fetch your revolver, not, I think, because we shall need it today, but because a clockmaker's workshop sealed like a tomb has a way of proving less simple than it first appears, and I have learned never to visit such places unarmed of at least the appearance of caution." Miss Pemberton rose also, drawing her black gloves back over hands that trembled now with something closer to hope than grief, and thanked Holmes in terms so simple and so evidently sincere that I saw even my friend's habitual reserve soften a degree in the face of them. She left us her card and the address of the Emporium, together with a small brass key to the side door, which she said Croft had given her some months before as a token of the trust her father did not yet know existed between them, and which she now pressed upon Holmes with the air of a woman surrendering her last and dearest possession to a stranger's keeping. Chapter 3. The Deductions of an Idle Morning. We took a hansom to Regent Street, and I make mention here of a small incident along the way, for it illustrates a facet of my friend's character that the urgency of the case might otherwise obscure. As we passed along Oxford Street, Holmes's attention was drawn, for no reason I could discern, to an elderly gentleman crossing before a stationer's shop, cane in hand. "A retired sea captain," Holmes murmured, "recently widowed, and troubled by a disagreement with his son over money, probably an inheritance." "Holmes, you cannot possibly know all that from a glimpse through a carriage window." "On the contrary, Watson, I know it with tolerable certainty. Observe the roll in his gait, which no amount of years ashore fully erases in a man who has spent decades upon a pitching deck. Observe, too, the black band upon his hat, worn in the old style favoured by men of his generation, and clearly recent by the crispness of the cloth. And the fact that he wears no ring, though the pale mark upon his finger shows one was worn for many years and removed only lately. A widower's habit, that, when the loss is fresh enough to still find the ring unbearable, and old enough that etiquette permits its removal. As for the son and the money, you will have noticed the letter protruding from his coat pocket, franked with a solicitor's seal, and the manner in which he crumples it in his fist rather than pockets it properly. The gesture of a man reading, for perhaps the third or fourth time, news he does not care for, from a family solicitor, concerning matters he would rather not have thrust upon him so soon after a bereavement. The old sea captain, quite unaware that he had furnished two strangers in a passing hansom with the whole shape of his private sorrows, continued upon his way, and was lost within moments to the crowd of Oxford Street, leaving me to marvel, as I had marvelled on so many similar occasions, that a life's quiet tragedy could be read so completely from a hat-band and a crumpled letter by a mind attuned to such signs. I confess I found, as I so often did, that once explained the matter seemed almost self-evident, and it was this very quality, the transformation of the miraculous into the obvious, that constituted, I have always believed, the truest measure of my friend's genius. I confess that I had, upon more than one occasion in our long association, attempted such small feats of deduction myself, with results so consistently wide of the mark that I had long since abandoned the practice, save as a private amusement, content instead to marvel at Holmes's facility rather than compete with it. "You perform these exercises," said I, "even when there is a graver matter at hand." "Particularly when there is a graver matter at hand, Watson. The mind is a muscle, and a case such as the one before us this morning will require it limber. Besides," he added, with a sidelong glance that carried more warmth than his words generally permitted him to show, "it amuses you, and heaven knows the morning has offered little enough amusement otherwise." We arrived presently at Pemberton's Emporium, its windows curtained now with black crape out of respect for the dead, though the crowd of the curious had already begun to gather upon the pavement in the manner peculiar to London whenever tragedy touches a respectable street. Lestrade met us at the door, his expression compounded of irritation and, though he would never have admitted it, a certain relief. "I did not send for you, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes agreed pleasantly. "Miss Pemberton did. I understand congratulations are in order. You have all but closed the case. We have the man's own apprentice with blood on his shirt and no alibi worth the name. What more do you require? Motive, perhaps, since I am given to understand the young man stood to gain his master's blessing and his daughter's hand regardless, and had no need of hastening the process by murder. But do not let me detain you from your certainties, Lestrade. I shall content myself with the scene of the crime, if you have no objection." Lestrade's objection, such as it was, evaporated before the practical consideration that Holmes's presence, however unwelcome, generally resulted in credit accruing to Scotland Yard rather than away from it, provided the newspapers were managed correctly. He waved us through with poor grace, muttering something under his breath about amateurs and lens glasses that Holmes affected not to hear, and led us past the small knot of constables stationed at the shop's front, through the outer room where the counters still displayed, with a kind of dreadful ordinariness, the watches and chains that had been Pemberton's stock in trade, and toward the narrow door at the rear that gave onto the workshop proper. It was thus that Holmes and I came, for the first time, to stand within the workshop where Josiah Pemberton had met his end. Chapter 4. The Locked Workshop. The room was precisely as it had been described to us, save that the body had been removed to the mortuary and a chalk outline traced upon the floorboards in its place. I have visited many scenes of violence in the course of my association with Sherlock Holmes, but few possessed the peculiar melancholy of that workshop, where 100 clocks of every size and nation stood arrested at the identical moment of 11 minutes past midnight, their pendulums stilled, their hands frozen in silent testimony to a violence that had, in some manner not yet apparent, reached out and touched even the machinery of time itself. Holmes moved about the chamber with the swift, silent economy of motion that I had watched 100 times before, his lens flashing now upon the floor, now upon the workbench, now upon the door itself, which he examined with particular care. The bolt, he observed, is of good manufacture, and shows no sign of having been forced or tampered with by any instrument inserted from without. The key, moreover, was found in the lock upon the inside, was it not, Lestrade? It was, turned fully home. Then we may set aside, for the present, any theory involving picklocks or duplicate keys inserted through the door itself, since a key already seated in the lock from within defeats such methods entirely, as I am sure you appreciate. He crossed to the window, drew himself up upon a stool to examine the bars and the sash, and descended again, dusting his knees. The window has not been opened in some considerable time. You will observe the paint has sealed the sash along its lower edge, unbroken, nor could a man pass those bars regardless, being scarce 4 inches apart, sufficient for a cat but no more. Then how, in heaven's name, I burst out, did the murderer enter or leave at all? That, Watson, is the very question upon which this case turns, and I do not propose to answer it upon a first inspection, however tempting the impulse. Let us instead attend to what the room tells us of the manner of the killing, and leave the manner of the killer's passage for later reflection. He turned next to the workbench itself, upon which lay scattered the delicate remains of half-finished mechanisms, a chronometer movement stripped to its bare plates, a quantity of tiny screws swept into disorder, a jeweller's loop still resting where its owner had set it down, for what he could not have known would be the last time. Holmes examined each object in turn with a patience that tried Lestrade's evident wish to be elsewhere, remarking at length upon the fine layer of metal filings undisturbed upon one corner of the bench, which told him, he said, that whatever struggle had taken place had not carried the 2 men across the whole of the room, but had been confined, brief and violent, to the space immediately before the door. You will observe also, Holmes continued, drawing our attention to a small brass instrument lying half-concealed beneath a fold of velvet cloth, that Pemberton kept always at hand a device of his own design for testing the balance of a movement, precisely the sort of tool a man might snatch up in the first instant of alarm, were an unwelcome visitor to advance upon him with hostile intent. That he did not do so, that no defensive wound marks his hands and no such instrument shows any trace of having been lifted in haste, suggests to me that the blow which killed him came as a complete surprise from someone he did not think to fear until the very moment it fell. He knelt now beside the chalk outline, examining the floorboards with his lens held scarce an inch from the wood. The blow was delivered from above and somewhat behind, as the surgeon's report indicates, and with an instrument neither too heavy nor too light. Observe the spread of the wound, which Lestrade's surgeon describes as broader than a poker, but narrower than a full-sized hammer. There is no such instrument left at the scene, which tells us the killer either carried it away or, more interestingly, employed something from this very room that has since been returned to its ordinary place, indistinguishable from its fellows. He rose and paced the narrow space between the workbench and the door, his eyes travelling across the shelves of silent clocks with the particular intensity I had come to recognize as the outward sign of some inward calculation not yet ready to be shared. There is a curious absence here, Watson, that troubles me rather more than any presence might. Where, I ask myself, are the tools of forced entry one would expect to find, scattered about a room broken into by violence? No splintered wood, no bent hinge, no scratch upon the lock plate. A murderer who enters by force generally leaves some mark of that force behind him. Our murderer left none whatever, which suggests to me that he required no force at all, having some gentler means of entry entirely at his disposal. He moved next among the clocks themselves, pausing before each in turn, a French carriage clock of gilt bronze, a plain English regulator of the sort favoured by railway stations, a small Swiss cuckoo of recent manufacture, and a dozen others besides, each one a small monument to its master's craft, and each one now silent, its hands frozen at the same unyielding hour. 100 clocks, Watson, representing perhaps 30 years of a single man's accumulated skill and affection, and every one of them stopped by a hand that cared nothing for their individual histories, only for the uniform lie they were made to tell. You mean the murder weapon may yet be here among the clocks? I mean it is entirely possible, though I do not yet assert it as fact. What I will assert, Watson, is this. Every clock in this chamber, without a single exception, has been stopped at 11 minutes past midnight. Now, a violent struggle might plausibly stop one clock, even two, if a table were overturned or a shelf disturbed in the fighting. But look about you. Clocks upon the far wall, clocks upon shelves never touched, clocks standing free upon the floor, in corners quite removed from any struggle, all arrested at the identical instant. That, Lestrade, is not the mark of violence. That is the mark of design. Lestrade frowned. You are suggesting someone stopped them all deliberately. To what purpose? To establish, beyond any dispute, the hour of the murder, said Holmes, rising and brushing the dust from his trousers, which is a curious thing for a murderer to wish to advertise, unless the true hour of death was rather different, and someone had urgent reason to fix it otherwise in the minds of the police. I saw Lestrade's face change, saw the first small crack appear in the certainty he had carried into the room, and I confess that I felt, in that moment, the familiar thrill of the chase beginning in earnest, though I could not then have guessed how far it would carry us, nor how dear a price the truth would exact before it was done. Chapter 5. The Testimony of the Neighbours. Having exhausted, for the present, the evidence the workshop itself could offer, Holmes turned his attention to the shopkeepers whose premises adjoined and faced Pemberton's Emporium along that stretch of Regent Street. It was here that we first heard mention of the figure who would give this narrative its title. Regent Street by day presented a very different face than the one it had shown to Constable Higgins in the grey hour of the murder's discovery, crowded now with carriages and pedestrians, shop fronts bright with the morning's trade, newsboys calling the latest edition with its lurid speculation upon the Pemberton affair already emblazoned across the front page. Holmes moved through this bustle with the unhurried patience of a man for whom the crowd itself was merely one more surface upon which small truths might be read, pausing here to exchange a word with a crossing sweeper, there to examine the pattern of foot traffic before the Emporium's darkened windows. The proprietor of a milliner's shop directly opposite, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Attridge, proved our most fruitful witness. She kept, she explained, irregular hours herself, often working late upon orders for the coming season, and her workroom window looked directly across the street at the side entrance to Pemberton's premises, a narrow door, used ordinarily only for deliveries, set into the alley that ran between the Emporium and the chandler's shop beside it. I have seen him perhaps 5 or 6 times these past 2 months, said she, always well after 11 at night, always the same cloaked figure, tall, moving quickly, and with his collar high against recognition. He would knock, 3 knocks, always 3, and always in the same pattern, quick, quick, slow, and the side door would open to admit him, though I never once saw who opened it from within. "And how long would he remain?" asked Holmes. "An hour, sometimes 2. I never saw him depart, Mr. Holmes, though I watched for it more than once, being of a curious turn myself. It was as though the street swallowed him whole each time, and only Mr. Pemberton's shop showed a light left burning." Holmes pressed her closely upon the figure's dress and bearing, and learned that he wore always the same dark ulster coat, that his boots, glimpsed once beneath a gas lamp, were of foreign cut, and that upon one occasion she believed she had caught the scent of tobacco quite unlike the mild shag that Englishmen generally favoured, something richer and more pungent. "The sort of thing," she said, "my late husband used to call a sailor's blend, from his years in the merchant marine." We heard similar, though less detailed accounts from a bootmaker 2 doors down, and from the chandler's apprentice, a boy of perhaps 15 who added the detail, offered shyly, as though he feared ridicule, that upon one occasion he had seen the cloaked visitor pause beneath the lamp at the alley's mouth and remove his hat to mop his brow, revealing, for the barest instant, a face he could not properly describe save that it seemed, in the boy's own words, familiar-like, though I couldn't say from where, sir, and it troubled me after, not being able to place it. "A most valuable observation," Holmes told the boy, with a gravity that plainly gratified him, for the sensation of half-recognizing a stranger is very often the mind's honest attempt to tell us we have, in fact, seen that face before, merely in circumstances that do not match our present expectation of it. He pressed the boy further upon the visitor's build and bearing, and learned that the stranger, though cloaked and hurried, moved with the careful, deliberate tread of a man who wished above all not to be heard, a detail the boy offered almost apologetically, as though it seemed too slight to matter, but which Holmes received with evident satisfaction, remarking afterward that a man who takes such pains to walk softly through a public alley is a man who knows, whatever his ostensible business, that his true purpose would not bear examination. We called also upon the proprietor of a small tobacconist some 3 doors distant, a Mr. Hallows, who confirmed the substance of Mrs. Attridge's account, and added, upon Holmes's close questioning, that he had once sold a quantity of a distinctive Turkish blend to a gentleman answering a similar description. Though the transaction had occurred by daylight and the customer's face, he confessed with some embarrassment, had left no lasting impression upon him beyond a general air of prosperous respectability ill-suited, in Hallow's private opinion, to furtive nighttime errands. As we walked back toward the Emporium, Watson beside him and Lestrade trailing with evident impatience, Holmes fell into the silence I had learned to recognize as the working of some private calculation. "The night visitor," said he at length, "came and went unseen not because he possessed some supernatural faculty, Watson, but because our witnesses, however observant, watched only the front of the shop and the alley door, never troubling themselves to watch the shop's interior, nor to ask what other exit that interior might conceal. A man who is never seen to leave has very often left by a door nobody thought to guard. You believe there is a second means of entrance we have not yet discovered. I believe, Watson, that a locked room is only as secure as the imagination of the man who insists upon its impossibility. I have as yet found no secret door, but I have not yet looked in earnest, and a workshop belonging to a master of intricate mechanism strikes me as precisely the sort of place where such a thing might be built, and built well enough to deceive even its own builder's daughter." Chapter 6. Nathaniel Croft's Confession. That afternoon, at Miss Pemberton's earnest request, we were permitted an interview with Nathaniel Croft, who had not yet been formally charged but was held, at Lestrade's insistence, under close watch at Scotland Yard, pending further evidence. He proved to be a slight, fair-haired young man of perhaps 26, his face drawn with sleeplessness, and a species of bewilderment that I, for one, found difficult to reconcile with guilt, though I had learned enough of criminal psychology from my association with Holmes not to trust such impressions unsupported by fact. The cell in which he was held was cold and sparsely furnished, and Croft himself sat upon its narrow bench, with the stunned stillness of a man who has not yet fully absorbed the calamity that has overtaken him, rising to his feet with evident effort when the warder announced our visit, and regarding us with an expression compounded equally of hope and dread. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, before either of us had spoken. "Isabella wrote that she meant to send for you. I did not dare to hope you would come so quickly, nor that you would trouble yourself over a case the newspapers have already decided against me." "The newspapers, Mr. Croft, decide a great many things incorrectly, and generally with considerable enthusiasm," Holmes replied, seating himself upon the room's single rickety chair, while I remained standing near the door. "I should like to hear the whole of your account, from the moment you left Mr. Pemberton's employ that evening, told in your own words and without regard for how it may sound to ears already inclined to doubt you." "I have told the inspector everything I know," said he, "which is precious little, and none of it, I fear, to my own advantage. I left the shop at 9, as Mr. Pemberton always required of me on weeknights, and walked directly to my lodgings near 7 Dials, stopping only at the corner public house for a single glass, as any man might. I recall reaching my room, recall removing my coat, and then nothing more until I woke near dawn in my chair, still dressed, with blood upon my cuff that I cannot account for, and a headache such as I have never known, though I am not a drinking man, and had taken no more than the 1 glass. Holmes listened with close attention, then asked, "You are quite certain it was only 1 glass?" "Quite certain, Mr. Holmes. I am not in the habit of losing count, nor of losing my senses upon so small a quantity." "And the public house, do you recall it being unusually crowded, or the glass itself tasting in any way unfamiliar?" Croft frowned in the effort of recollection. "Now that you mention it, yes. It had a bitterness to it I put down to a poor batch, and I recall feeling the effects more strongly and more swiftly than a single glass ought to produce, even in a man of my modest habits. I thought little of it at the time, being more concerned with the hour and my walk home." "And do you recall the face of whoever stood you that drink, or was near you at the bar?" "I paid for it myself, Mr. Holmes, and drank alone, so far as I recall, though the place was dim, and I own I did not look closely about me." Holmes rose and paced the narrow cell twice before speaking again. "Mr. Croft, I put it to you that you were drugged, deliberately, and by a hand skilled enough to judge the dose, so that you would wake confused, incriminated, and in no state to construct any defence save the plain truth, which experience teaches is precisely the defence a jury trusts least. Can you think of any soul who might wish you silenced in this particular fashion, rather than simply murdered outright?" "I cannot conceive it, sir. I have no enemies that I know of. I am an apprentice of no particular consequence, save that I loved Isabella and hoped, God willing, to earn her father's blessing within the year." "Precisely so," said Holmes softly, almost to himself. "A young man of no particular consequence, save that his removal, whether by the gallows or merely by suspicion, would leave Miss Pemberton unprotected, the Emporium without an heir apparent to its trade secrets, and the true murderer very considerably less scrutinized than he presently finds himself. I begin to think, Watson, that our night visitor required not merely an opportunity, but a scapegoat prepared well in advance, which argues a mind that plans in months, not minutes." Before we took our leave, Holmes asked one further question, delivered in a tone so casual that I nearly missed its significance. "Mr. Croft, in the weeks before Mr. Pemberton's death, did you observe any change in his manner? Any visitor received with particular secrecy? Any correspondence he seemed anxious to keep from your eye?" Croft considered this with the slow care of a man determined to be helpful in whatever small way remained to him. "Now that you ask it, sir, there was a gentleman's card left upon his desk perhaps a fortnight past, which he snatched away the moment he saw me glance at it, though I caught enough of the name to think it began with an F. I thought nothing of it at the time, business being business, but he was unlike himself for the better part of that afternoon, short with his answers and distracted at his bench in a manner I had never known him to be. Holmes exchanged no glance with me, gave no outward sign that the detail struck him as significant, but I had known him long enough to recognize the faint stillness that settled upon his features whenever a fact fell precisely into the place he had already prepared for it. We left Croft with what comfort we could offer, which was little enough in words, but, I hoped, something more substantial in the knowledge that Sherlock Holmes now believed, however privately, in his innocence. Chapter 7. The Weight of Circumstance. Lestrade, however, remained unmoved by speculation concerning drugged ale and scapegoats prepared in advance, and I confess that from the standpoint of hard evidence his scepticism was not unreasonable. The case against Croft, considered without Holmes's particular illuminations, appeared damning indeed, and it thickened further over the following 2 days. A search of Croft's lodgings turned up, tucked within a drawer of his small writing desk, a letter from Josiah Pemberton, dated a fortnight before the murder, in which the old clockmaker expressed, in terms both blunt and wounding, his settled opposition to any match between his daughter and a penniless apprentice with more sentiment than prospects. The letter forbade Croft from any further private communication with Isabella, and threatened dismissal should the young man persist. Here, Lestrade declared with evident satisfaction, was motive enough to satisfy any coroner's jury. A young suitor, spurned and threatened with ruin, who had struck out at the man standing between himself and both love and livelihood. Isabella herself, when shown the letter by a not unsympathetic Lestrade, confirmed its authenticity with evident distress, admitting that her father had indeed written in such terms upon at least one occasion, though she insisted, with some heat, that he had softened considerably in his opposition during the weeks that followed, and had given her private reason to believe that a formal engagement might yet be sanctioned before the year was out. This softening, she said, coincided curiously with the very period in which her father had grown reticent and distracted, working late into the night upon business he would not discuss even with her, a detail that seemed to trouble Holmes rather more than it troubled Lestrade, who saw in it only further evidence of a household in domestic disarray. Holmes read the letter twice through with no visible change of expression, then asked to see the envelope in which it had arrived. This, too, he examined at some length, remarking only that the postmark showed the letter to have been sent from a receiving office some distance from Regent Street, in a district Pemberton was not otherwise known to frequent. A small point, he admitted, but one he preferred not to discard merely for its smallness. Meanwhile, the coroner's inquest, convened with unseemly haste at Lestrade's urging, returned a verdict implicating Croft by name, though stopping short of formal accusation of murder, pending further police investigation. The newspapers, ever hungry for a villain with a face and a story, seized upon the tragic apprentice of Regent Street with unrestrained relish, publishing artists' impressions of Croft's face beside solemn editorials upon the perils of allowing young men of no fortune to aspire above their station, and I watched with some distress as Isabella Pemberton's composure, so remarkable upon our first meeting, began at last to fray under the weight of public opinion arrayed so entirely against the man she loved. One paper went so far as to print a fanciful reconstruction of the murder, complete with an engraving of the workshop and a dotted line purporting to show Croft's supposed movements upon the fatal night, a piece of pure invention that Holmes read through twice with an expression of such withering contempt that I feared for the safety of our breakfast crockery. "They will hang him upon a letter and a bloodied cuff," she said to us, on the evening of the second day, in a voice that trembled now for the first time in my hearing, and no one troubles to ask how a man locked within his own workshop, bolted from within, came to be murdered at all, if the murderer was safely asleep 3 miles distant, and drugged besides. "They will not hang him," said Holmes, with a quiet firmness that I knew he did not permit himself to voice lightly, though I own the case against him grows more elaborate by the hour, in a manner I find considerably more suspicious than reassuring. A true criminal case builds slowly, Miss Pemberton, accumulating evidence as a river gathers silt. This case has been assembled with the speed and precision of a stage set, motive supplied by convenient letter, opportunity supplied by convenient blood, and alibi destroyed by convenient drink. I begin to suspect we are not investigating a murder so much as admiring a murderer's handiwork, laid out for our benefit with rather more artistry than candour. It was a remark that would prove in time to be the truest thing said in the whole affair, though its full significance would not become apparent to me until Holmes had uncovered the secret that he had, even then, already begun to keep from us both. Chapter 8. A Discrepancy in Time. It was upon the third day, returning alone to the Emporium, on some pretext of settling a small matter of dust, that Holmes made the discovery he would, for reasons of his own, withhold from Lestrade, and even, for a time, from me. He had asked Mrs. Hudson to procure him, through discreet channels, the horological journals to which Josiah Pemberton had been a subscriber, and had spent the better part of an evening in close study of an article, published some 18 months previously, in which Pemberton himself had written at length upon his personal practice of never permitting 2 clocks in his workshop to keep precisely identical time. It was his professional habit, Holmes explained to me only after the fact, when the matter could no longer be concealed, to stagger every timepiece in his possession by some small margin, a minute here, 2 minutes there, precisely so that he might test, by their gradual and varying drift, the true accuracy of each mechanism against its fellows. A clockmaker's workshop in which every clock agrees to the minute is, Watson, as unnatural a sight as a garden in which every flower blooms upon the identical day. It does not happen by chance. It happens by hand. This observation, confirmed by the man's own published words, told Holmes with certainty what he had only suspected upon our first visit, that someone, almost certainly the murderer himself, had, after the killing, gone methodically about that chamber of 100 clocks, and reset every one to the identical hour of 11 minutes past midnight, thereby fixing that hour in the minds of the police as the moment of death, whatever the truth might actually have been. But why, I had asked him, when at last he shared this much, would a murderer trouble himself with such elaborate deception, when a simple flight from the scene would serve as well? Because, Watson, an alibi is only as good as the hour it must defeat. If our murderer required an alibi for 11 minutes past midnight specifically, because he could account for his whereabouts at that precise hour, and no other, then he had every reason to ensure the police believed in that hour absolutely, and no other, however inconvenient the true hour of Pemberton's death might prove to his own movements. I turned this reasoning over in my mind for some while after Holmes had spoken, and found, the longer I considered it, that it possessed a chilling elegance quite its own. For a man who fixes so precisely upon a single hour must, by definition, know already where he stood at every other hour that night, and such certainty argued a mind that had rehearsed its own defence long before any accusation had been made. What Holmes did not tell me, what he kept, in fact, entirely to himself for some days more, in a manner that I confess caused me no small vexation when at last I learned the reason, was that he had already begun to suspect the identity of the man for whom 11 minutes past midnight formed so convenient an alibi, and that the suspicion touched upon a name neither Lestrade nor Isabella Pemberton had yet spoken aloud in connection with the crime. He would say only, when I pressed him that evening in our rooms at Baker Street, "There are moments, Watson, when a detective owes his client the truth entire, and moments when he owes her only the truth's protection, until such time as it may be delivered whole and beyond dispute. We are not yet at the former moment. I ask your patience a little longer. I gave it, though not without misgiving, a misgiving that would prove, before the case was ended, entirely justified. For my own part, I spent that evening turning over in my mind the small fact of the visiting card Croft had described, its truncated name beginning with an F, and wondered whether Holmes's silence upon the matter concealed a suspicion already fully formed, or merely a thread he dared not follow aloud until he had gathered courage enough to trust it. I did not then know how close I had come to guessing the truth, nor how carefully Holmes had already begun to build, in the privacy of his own reasoning, the case that would in time bring a respected tradesman to the dock. Chapter 9. Lestrade's Certainty. While Holmes pursued his private line of inquiry with a discretion that left even me somewhat in the dark, Lestrade proceeded with the confident tread of a man who believed the case all but closed. He had, by the fourth day, assembled what he considered conclusive proof, the letter forbidding the match, the blood upon Croft's cuff, confirmed by the police surgeon to be of the same rare type as the victim's own, and, most damning of all, a witness, a coal carrier making his early rounds, who now came forward to swear he had seen a figure, answering Croft's general description, hurrying away from the mouth of the Regent Street alley at some time near midnight. The coal carrier himself, a weathered man named Briggs who plied his trade along that stretch of pavement each morning before dawn, had given his statement with the plain, unadorned confidence of a working man unaccustomed to public notice, and Lestrade, who had interviewed him personally, pronounced himself entirely satisfied with the fellow's honesty and sobriety alike. "You see, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the particular satisfaction of a man vindicated after doubt, "the pieces fit together as neat as a jigsaw. Motive, opportunity, blood evidence, and now an eyewitness. I do not say I enjoy the prospect of seeing so young a man to the gallows, but the evidence permits no other conclusion." "The evidence," Holmes replied evenly, "permits precisely the conclusion someone has laboured with great care to make it permit, Lestrade, which is not always the same thing as the truth. Your coal carrier saw a figure of Croft's general height and build, in poor light, at a considerable distance, hurrying, as any honest late traveller might hurry through a disreputable alley at that hour, from fear alone. Did he see the man's face? He could not swear to it, given the dark. But the build of half the young men in London, I should imagine. I do not dismiss the testimony, Lestrade. I merely observe that it proves considerably less than you suppose, and that a case built entirely upon proving considerably less than it appears to is, in my experience, the very signature of a guilty man clever enough to let others do his accusing for him." Lestrade, to his credit, was not a stupid man, whatever his impatience, and something in Holmes's tone gave him pause. "You have found something you are not telling me." "I have found several somethings," Holmes admitted, "none of which I am yet prepared to swear to before a magistrate, and all of which would collapse like a house of cards were I to voice them prematurely, and thereby warn the true architect of this affair that his handiwork has been noticed. I ask only this, Lestrade. Delay any formal charge against Mr. Croft by 1 week. If I have not, by the end of that week, produced evidence sufficient to satisfy even your exacting standards, you may proceed against him with my full and public concurrence." It was, I knew, a considerable gamble on Holmes's part, for Lestrade's patience was a finite resource, and the newspaper's clamour for a swift resolution grew louder by the day. But something in my friend's quiet certainty, a certainty I had learned, over years of association, never to discount however little evidence he chose to share, persuaded the inspector to grant the delay, with poor grace but genuine consent. 1 week, Mr. Holmes, not a day more." 1 week, Holmes agreed, will suffice, I believe, provided our night visitor does not grow suspicious that his elegant construction has begun, ever so slightly, to show its joints. I own that I myself had begun, by this point in our investigation, to feel the strain of Holmes's secrecy rather keenly, for it was no small thing to watch a young man's fate hang in the balance while my closest friend declined, for reasons of his own devising, to share the full particulars of his reasoning even with me. Yet I had learned, across the years, that such reticence generally concealed not carelessness but caution, and that Holmes's silences were themselves a kind of evidence, offered to no one but trusted absolutely by those who knew him best. Lestrade departed in a temper somewhat improved from his arrival, though he could not resist a final word of caution as he gathered his hat and gloves. "Mind you, Mr. Holmes, if this week produces nothing, I shall proceed against the boy with a clear conscience, and no talk of forged alibis or drugged ale will hold me back a second time." Holmes bowed him out with a courtesy that did not entirely conceal his amusement at the inspector's need to reassert, however unnecessarily, an authority neither of us had ever seriously questioned. When the door had closed, Holmes turned to me with an energy that had been notably absent these several days past. "Now, Watson, we may work in earnest." Unburdened by the necessity of persuading Lestrade of conclusions I have not yet fully proved, even to my own satisfaction. Chapter 10. The Second Blow. The delay very nearly proved fatal to Holmes's design, for on the fifth night, but 2 days into the week Lestrade had granted, a second act of violence occurred that threw the entire investigation into fresh disarray. Mr. Aldous Fenwick, a clockmaker of some reputation whose premises stood scarce a quarter-mile from Pemberton's own, and whose name had arisen once or twice in the course of our inquiries as a former business associate of the dead man, was discovered by his housekeeper in the small hours, unconscious upon the floor of his own study, having suffered a blow to the head similar in character, though mercifully not in severity, to that which had killed Pemberton. The housekeeper, a nervous woman named Mrs. Poole, who had served Fenwick some 15 years, had been roused by a crash from below stairs and had descended, candle in hand, to find her master sprawled amid his scattered papers, breathing but insensible, and no sign whatever of any intruder remaining in the house. News of the attack reached Baker Street before the sun was fully risen, and I recall Holmes reading the messenger's hastily scrawled note with an expression that combined alarm with something almost like grim vindication, as though the very violence of the event confirmed a suspicion he had not yet permitted himself to voice aloud even to me. Beside him lay a strong-box, forced open, its contents, a quantity of old papers and a small leather-bound notebook, apparently rifled, though whether anything had actually been taken Fenwick himself, upon regaining consciousness some hours later, could not immediately say. Holmes was at the scene within the hour, having been roused by a messenger boy before Lestrade's own summons had even reached Baker Street, and I accompanied him in a state of considerable alarm, for the attack upon Fenwick suggested, at the very least, that our murderer remained active and dangerous, and at the worst, that our week's grace had been purchased at the cost of an innocent man's safety. "You will forgive me, Watson," Holmes murmured as our cab rattled through the dark streets, "if I confess that I anticipated some such move, though I had hoped to prevent it rather than merely arrive in its aftermath. I had not accounted for the possibility that our adversary might grow so impatient so quickly. You suspected Fenwick was in danger? I suspected Fenwick possessed something our murderer required, and had not yet succeeded in obtaining from Pemberton, before that gentleman's death rendered the matter considerably more urgent. Whether Fenwick himself is entirely the innocent victim he will doubtless present himself as being, I have not yet determined. A man may be struck down by his own confederate quite as readily as by his enemy, when a confederate begins to fear discovery. Fenwick's study, when we were admitted to it, presented a scene of considerable disorder. Papers scattered across the carpet, a chair overturned, and the strong-box itself, a heavy iron affair of old-fashioned pattern, standing open upon the desk with its lock forced by some crude instrument that had left deep gouges in the metal plate surrounding the keyhole. A single lamp burned low upon the mantel, casting long shadows across the room's expensive but curiously impersonal furnishings. The sort of room, I thought, that belonged to a man who had accumulated wealth without ever quite learning to enjoy the comforts it might purchase. We found Fenwick, upon our arrival, sufficiently recovered to speak, though pale and shaken, and attended by a doctor of the neighbourhood who pronounced the wound serious but not life-threatening. Fenwick himself proved a stout, florid man of perhaps 55, with the guarded manner of one long accustomed to protecting professional secrets, and his account of the attack was frustratingly vague. He had heard a sound below stairs, descended to investigate, and recalled nothing further until waking to find his housekeeper bent over him. Holmes, however, showed particular interest in the rifled strong-box and its scattered contents, examining the papers with care before Lestrade's men could disturb their arrangement further. Among them he drew my attention, though he said nothing of it aloud in Fenwick's hearing, to a set of technical drawings depicting the internal escapement of a chronometer, annotated in 2 distinct hands, one of which I recognized, having by now seen samples enough, as belonging unmistakably to the dead Josiah Pemberton. "A shared invention," Holmes murmured to me later, once we had withdrawn, "or a disputed one. Either way, Watson, I begin to perceive the shape of a motive considerably older and considerably more valuable than a daughter's disappointed marriage or an apprentice's wounded pride. We are dealing, I think, with a secret 2 men built together many years ago, and which one of them has lately determined to keep entirely for himself, whatever the cost to his former partner." Lestrade, arriving somewhat after ourselves and considerably out of temper at having been summoned from his bed a second time within the week, pressed Holmes for his theory of the attack, only to receive the same courteous but unyielding reticence that had characterized my friend's manner these several days past. "I have a theory, Lestrade, but a theory unproved is worth less than the paper it is written upon, and I do not propose to hand you a half-built case that our adversary might demolish at his leisure the moment he learns we suspect him. Trust me a little longer, and I promise you a conclusion worth the waiting," the inspector grumbled, as was his habit, but consented, for he had by now some small experience of how such promises from Sherlock Holmes were generally redeemed. Chapter 11. Holmes' Restless Nights. The days that followed the attack upon Fenwick were, for me, among the most trying of the entire affair, for Holmes withdrew into a silence broken only by long hours at his chemical table, apparently unrelated experiments that I later understood to have been concerned with matters of ink, paper, and the aging of documents, and by 2 separate visits, conducted alone and without explanation, to the Patent Office in Chancery Lane. He slept scarcely at all, subsisting upon black coffee and the occasional pipe of the strong shag he favoured when a problem pressed hardest upon him, and on more than one occasion I discovered him at 3 in the morning, still in his dressing gown, tracing lines upon a great sheet of paper pinned to the wall of our sitting-room. A chronology, as I saw when at last he permitted me to examine it, of every documented meeting, correspondence, and dispute between Josiah Pemberton and Aldous Fenwick, across a span of some 25 years. The great sheet of paper, when at last I examined it closely, revealed a chronology of remarkable detail, drawn in Holmes's small, precise hand and annotated with dates culled from old trade directories, defunct partnership registers, and the yellowing back numbers of horological journals that Holmes had somehow contrived to have delivered to our door at all hours. Names I did not recognize appeared and disappeared along its length, witnesses to old contracts, clerks at long-dissolved firms, a solicitor in Gray's Inn who had, it seemed, once handled certain private matters for both Pemberton and Fenwick in years gone by. They were partners once, he told me, on the 6th night, when weariness had finally softened his customary reticence, young men together in a small workshop in Clerkenwell, before either had made his name. They developed, between them, an improved form of chronometer escapement. A small thing, Watson, a matter of springs and levers that means nothing to you or me, but which represents, In the world of fine horology, a considerable fortune to whichever man can prove sole authorship of it before the Admiralty's Contracting Board, which is even now considering tenders for a new naval standard timepiece. And you believe one of them claimed sole credit unjustly? I believe, from the drawings recovered at Fenwick's house, and from certain records at the Patent Office that required rather more persuasion than money to obtain, that the original patent, filed some 20 years ago under Fenwick's name alone, was in fact substantially the work of Pemberton, and that Fenwick's claim to sole invention rested upon a forged assignment of rights, purportedly signed by Pemberton in his youth, surrendering all claim in exchange for a modest sum. I do not yet know whether that signature is genuine or false, but I know that Pemberton himself had begun, in recent months, to gather evidence suggesting it was false. Evidence that would have stripped Fenwick of both fortune and reputation had it reached the Admiralty's board before their contract was awarded. I sat back, the shape of the thing beginning at last to clarify before me. Then Fenwick had every reason to silence him. I confess that, hearing this laid out so plainly, I found myself marvelling anew at the patience such a scheme required. 25 years of maintained deception, sustained through countless small anxieties and near discoveries, until at last the whole edifice threatened to collapse under the weight of one old partner's belated conscience. Every reason in the world, Watson, and a further reason besides, which I have only lately confirmed. Fenwick and Pemberton, whatever their public estrangement these past 20 years, had in fact resumed a private and clandestine correspondence some months ago, precipitated, I believe, by Pemberton's discovery of the forgery and his subsequent demand that Fenwick either confess the truth publicly or purchase his silence at a price considerably steeper than the original sum. It is my belief, though I do not yet possess proof sufficient to swear to it, that our cloaked night visitor, glimpsed by Mrs. Attridge and the chandler's boy across these past 2 months, was Aldous Fenwick himself, come by night to negotiate, or to threaten, the old partner he had wronged a quarter of a century before. Then why has he not simply been arrested? Holmes rose, crossing to the window and gazing out upon the dark and fog-bound street below. Because knowing a man's motive, Watson, is not the same as knowing how he passed through a locked and bolted door to commit his crime, nor how he contrived so elaborate an alibi for 11 minutes past midnight that even a search of his movements that night shows him, apparently, dining in full view of 6 witnesses at his club in Pall Mall. Until I have solved the mechanism of the crime as thoroughly as I have solved its motive, Lestrade will not act, nor should he, and Fenwick, forewarned, will destroy whatever remains of the evidence that might yet hang him. Then his club alibi is false. His club alibi is, I suspect, perfectly genuine as far as it goes, Watson, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous a thing to challenge without proof. 6 respectable gentlemen will swear he dined among them until well past midnight, and 6 respectable gentlemen do not lie for a man's convenience. The falsehood, if falsehood there be, lies not in where Fenwick was at that hour, but in what hour the murder actually occurred. A distinction Lestrade, in his eagerness for a swift conclusion, has not troubled himself to examine as closely as the matter deserves. I confess this observation, delivered with such quiet certainty, did more to convince me of Fenwick's guilt than any single fact Holmes had yet produced, for it demonstrated a subtlety of reasoning that seemed to me, even after so many years of witnessing it, little short of miraculous. Chapter 12. The Hidden Passage. It was upon the 7th day, the very last of the week Lestrade had granted, that Holmes at last resolved the question of the locked room, and I had the privilege of accompanying him to the discovery. We returned to Pemberton's Emporium in the grey hour before dawn, at Holmes' particular insistence that we should see the workshop under the identical quality of light in which its former master had so often worked alone at night. Holmes carried with him a small folding rule and a device of his own construction, a sort of weighted plumb line fitted with a brass pointer, the purpose of which he did not immediately explain. A workshop belonging to a maker of intricate mechanisms, he said, as we let ourselves in with the key Isabella had provided, is precisely the sort of place where a man might build a secret his own daughter never suspected, provided he built it with the same patience and precision he brought to his clocks. I have been searching these past days, not for a door, for we have established there is none, but for a panel. He began a methodical examination of the workshop's rear wall, the very wall against which the great long-case clock, the largest timepiece in the room, and one that Mrs. Attridge's testimony suggested, had never, in her recollection, actually chimed the hour like its fellows, stood in solitary state. Holmes ran his fingers along its carved moulding, tapped gently at intervals along its base, and at length, with a small exclamation of satisfaction, pressed upon a curl of decorative scrollwork some 18 inches from the floor. There was a soft click, scarcely audible, and the entire rear panel of the great clock's case, together with a corresponding section of the wall behind it, swung inward upon a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow passage, black as pitch, that ran, as we confirmed by careful exploration with a lantern, some 15 feet before opening upon a second, smaller door, set flush into the brickwork of the alley wall itself, disguised upon its outer face as an unremarkable section of coal-cellar grating. The air within smelled of old dust and cold stone, undisturbed, it seemed, by any regular use, save for a worn patch upon the floor immediately before the concealed panel, where countless footsteps, over what must have been years, had left their faint but unmistakable mark upon the ancient flagstones. I confess a certain shiver passed through me as I stood in that narrow darkness, reflecting upon how many nights Fenwick, or whoever the visitor had been, must have crept along this self-same passage, unseen and unsuspected, while the whole of Regent Street slept in ignorance above and around him. "There is our night visitor's true entrance, Watson," said Holmes, holding his lantern high within the narrow space. "And there, I do not doubt, is the answer to Mrs. Attridge's puzzlement at never seeing her cloaked visitor depart. He entered by the alley, passed through this passage built, I should imagine, by Pemberton himself, in his younger and more trusting days, for reasons we may never fully know, perhaps originally as nothing more sinister than a private means of coming and going without disturbing his household above. He let himself into the workshop directly, conducted whatever business or confrontation brought him, and departed by the self-same route, leaving the shop's front door and bolt entirely undisturbed throughout, for he had never once needed to touch them. But the door was bolted from within when the body was found, because Fenwick bolted it himself upon his final visit, Watson, the visit upon which he killed Pemberton. He required the police to believe the room impregnable, for an impregnable room implicates no outsider, and directs suspicion instead toward whoever might be presumed to possess a key to the front, namely, the apprentice who worked there daily. Having struck the fatal blow, he reset every clock in the chamber to the hour he required as his alibi, bolted the front door from within to complete the illusion of an impossible crime, and withdrew by the very passage that had admitted him, sealing the panel behind him so perfectly that neither daughter nor apprentice, in 6 years and 24 years respectively, had ever suspected its existence. I confess that even after so many years in Holmes's company, I felt afresh the particular vertigo that accompanies the collapse of an apparent impossibility into simple, almost pedestrian, mechanism. Then we have him, Holmes, the passage alone. The passage alone proves only that a means existed, Watson, not that Fenwick employed it, nor that he struck the blow. For that, I require rather more than architecture. I require Fenwick himself, caught in the act of protecting the one piece of evidence he dares not destroy and cannot safely keep, the forged assignment of patent rights that started this whole tragedy a quarter century ago, and which I have every reason to believe he retrieved from Pemberton's workshop on the very night of the murder, and has kept close ever since, unable to burn it, for it is the sole proof that the invention was ever his to claim at all, should any future rival dispute his title, as Fenwick himself once disputed Pemberton's. We spent a further hour within the passage itself, Holmes measuring its dimensions with his folding rule, and noting, with evident satisfaction, a faint but consistent wear upon the brickwork at shoulder height, precisely where a man of Fenwick's stout build might be expected to brush against the wall in passing. He collected also, from a crevice near the alley door, a single thread of dark woolen cloth, which he held to the lamp for some minutes before pocketing with the air of a man who has found one small stone to complete a larger mosaic. A thread from an Ulster coat, Watson, of a weight and weave not commonly favoured by younger men, who prefer a lighter cut. It will not alone convict Fenwick before a jury, but it will serve, I think, to convince Lestrade that our theory rests upon rather more than air. Chapter 13. The Bait of the Grand Auction. Holmes's plan, when at last he unfolded it to Lestrade and myself upon the evening of that 7th day, possessed the particular elegance I had come to expect of my friend's stratagems, an elegance built not upon force, but upon the exploitation of a single character trait, precisely identified. Aldous Fenwick, said Holmes, is, whatever else he may be, a man of considerable pride in his professional reputation, a pride that has led him to forgery, blackmail, and now murder, rather than see it diminished. I propose we offer that pride an irresistible temptation. The scheme was this. Holmes would cause to be published, in the horological trade journals to which Fenwick himself subscribed, an announcement that the estate of the late Josiah Pemberton, in settling its affairs, had discovered among the dead man's private papers a complete set of original working drawings for the disputed chronometer escapement, drawings that would, upon examination by the Admiralty's Contracting Board, conclusively establish the true authorship of the invention beyond any possibility of dispute, and that these drawings would be presented for verification at a small private gathering of horological experts to be held at Pemberton's Emporium itself, 3 evenings hence. The announcement itself, when it appeared, was a masterpiece of understated provocation, worded by Holmes with the same precision he brought to every aspect of his craft, specific enough to convince, vague enough to avoid legal difficulty, and calculated at every turn to prey upon the exact anxieties that a guilty man in Fenwick's position could not fail to feel. Holmes read it aloud to us with evident satisfaction before it went to press, remarking that a well-constructed lie, properly aimed, could accomplish in a single evening what weeks of ordinary investigation might never achieve. He cannot risk ignoring such an announcement, Holmes explained, for if genuine, it exposes his forgery beyond any hope of concealment, and if false, as he cannot be certain it is not, he dares not leave it unchallenged, lest silence itself be read as an admission. He will come, Lestrade, by the selfsame passage he has used before, for he will not risk the front door and the possibility of being seen and questioned. And when he comes, we shall be waiting, not in the workshop itself, where his suspicion might be roused by any unfamiliar presence, but within the passage he believes entirely his own secret. Lestrade, to his credit, raised the obvious objection, and if he does not come by the passage at all, but sends some confederate, or simply burns his forged papers and lets the matter lie, then we shall have lost nothing but 3 evenings' patience, Holmes replied, though I do not believe he will choose that course. A man who has murdered once to protect a secret does not easily abandon that secret to chance publication, particularly when the alternative, confirming its destruction with his own hand, one final time, to be certain no fragment survives to incriminate him, lies so conveniently within his reach by a route he alone, so far as he knows, possesses the means to travel. I confess some misgiving at the plan, which required that we lie in wait, 3 men crowded into a passage scarce 4 feet across, for a period of hours that might stretch through an entire night with no certainty of result. But Isabella Pemberton, when consulted, gave her consent without hesitation, declaring that she would gladly surrender every drawing her father had ever made if it meant seeing justice done for his death and freedom restored to the man she loved. Isabella herself, though pale with the strain of the preceding days, insisted upon remaining in an upstairs room throughout the vigil, near enough to be summoned should her presence be required, and it fell to me, in a quiet moment before the trap was sprung, to sit with her a while and offer what reassurance I could that her father's memory would soon be vindicated and her betrothed's name cleared beyond all doubt. She bore the waiting, I thought, with a courage that did her considerable credit, though I saw her hands tighten upon her needlework whenever a sound below stairs suggested the hour might at last be at hand. And so, upon the appointed evening, with the announcement duly published and the small gathering of experts, in reality Lestrade's own men, dressed for the part, assembled in the front of the shop, Holmes, Lestrade and I took up our positions within the narrow darkness of the secret passage, lanterns shuttered, revolvers to hand, and settled ourselves to wait for whatever the night might bring. Chapter 14. The Trap Sprung. The hours passed with a slowness I have rarely known equalled, even in the course of our many vigils together. The passage was cold, close, and utterly without light, save for the faint glow that crept beneath the workshop door at its farther end, where the false gathering of experts murmured over drawings that Holmes had, with characteristic thoroughness, caused to be prepared as convincing forgeries of Pemberton's own hand. I passed the time listening to the small sounds of the building settling about us, the distant rumble of a late cab upon the street beyond, and the steady, controlled breathing of my companions beside me in the dark, each of us straining our ears for the first sound of the alley door. It was some minutes past 11, the very hour that had been so carefully manufactured as an alibi in the original crime, a coincidence Holmes remarked upon afterward as fitting, if unplanned, when we heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of the alley door easing open upon its hinges, followed by soft footsteps advancing through the darkness toward us. Holmes's hand closed upon my arm in silent warning, and we 3 pressed ourselves against the passage wall as the footsteps drew nearer, accompanied now by the laboured breathing of a stout man unaccustomed to such exertion, and by a low muttering that resolved, as he came closer still, into a string of curses directed at Pemberton's memory, at the announcement that had forced this final desperate visit, and at the fate that had made a murderer of a man who had, by his own muttered admission, only ever wanted what was rightfully mine. He passed within a foot of where we stood concealed, his lantern's narrow beam sweeping so close to Holmes's face that I held my breath in dread of discovery, but his attention was fixed entirely upon the panel ahead, and he did not pause. It was only when his hand had actually closed upon the mechanism to open the false clock case from within, intending, we later learned, to retrieve and destroy at last the forged assignment he had hidden, upon the night of the murder, within a hollow compartment of the very clock that concealed the passage itself, that Holmes stepped forward from the shadows. "Good evening, Mr. Fenwick," said he, his voice carrying that particular quality of quiet, terrible calm that I had heard him employ at the culmination of a dozen such affairs. "I fear the drawings you have come to examine, or to destroy, will disappoint you upon close inspection. They are, I confess, my own construction entirely, executed rather more hastily than I should have liked, though sufficient, it appears, to draw you back to the scene of your crime one final time." Fenwick recoiled with a cry that was more animal than human, his lantern falling and guttering upon the passage floor, and for one terrible moment I believed he meant to fight his way past us into the darkness of the alley beyond. But Lestrade, moving with a swiftness that did credit to his profession, had already placed himself squarely across the narrow exit, and Fenwick, finding himself trapped between Holmes before him and Lestrade behind, seemed at last to comprehend the completeness of his ruin. "You cannot prove it," he gasped, though his voice carried no real conviction. "You cannot prove any of it. A passage, a coincidence of timing." "I can prove," said Holmes, retrieving the fallen lantern and holding it steady between them, "a great deal more than you suppose, Mr. Fenwick, and I propose, if you will accompany us without further difficulty to the workshop beyond this wall, to demonstrate precisely how much." For a moment Fenwick seemed almost to consider some further show of resistance, his eyes darting between the two exits now equally barred to him, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that spoke as eloquently as any words of the collapse of whatever composure had sustained him through his weeks of careful deception. Then, quite suddenly, the fight went out of him altogether, and he sagged against the passage wall with the defeated air of a man who understands that the game, however long and cleverly played, has at last reached its final move. "Very well," he said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. Let us have done with it." Chapter 15. Fenwick's Undoing. We conducted Fenwick, subdued now and trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and despair, into the workshop itself, where the assembled experts, Lestrade's constables, still maintaining their disguise until their inspector's signal released them from it, looked on with undisguised astonishment as the truth began, piece by piece, to unfold. "You will forgive me," Holmes began, addressing Fenwick directly, though his words were plainly intended for the benefit of every soul in that crowded room, "if I recount the history of your crime in the order I came to understand it myself, for I believe you will find, in my errors as much as in my successes, a certain instruction as to where your own scheme very nearly succeeded, and where it did not. 25 years ago, you and Josiah Pemberton, then young men together, developed between you an improved chronometer escapement of real value, a genuine collaboration, I believe, in which Pemberton's mechanical insight and your own business acumen played roughly equal parts. But you wanted the whole of the credit and the whole of the reward, and so you procured, by means I do not yet fully understand but which I do not doubt involved considerable deception, a document purporting to be Pemberton's own signed renunciation of any claim to the invention, in exchange for a sum I suspect was considerably less than his true share deserved. Upon this forged foundation you built your reputation and your fortune these 25 years, while Pemberton, whether from pride, from ignorance of his own rights, or from some private arrangement I have not fully traced, made no public challenge to your claim, until, some months ago, he discovered proof that the signature upon that renunciation was not, in fact, his own. Fenwick said nothing, but his face had gone the colour of old parchment. He came to you privately, not the police, Holmes continued, for he was, whatever his faults, a man reluctant to see an old friend's ruin trumpeted publicly if a private reckoning might serve as well. He demanded, I believe, either a full and honest confession before the Admiralty's board, which is even now weighing contracts for a new standard naval timepiece, and would surely have found your forgery relevant to the character of any tenderer, or else compensation of a magnitude that would have beggared you. These meetings, conducted always at night, always by the passage you yourself must have known of, or perhaps helped Pemberton conceal in your younger and more trusting years together, were observed, imperfectly but sufficiently, by neighbours across the street, who took you for some mysterious night visitor, never suspecting that the truth was rather more mundane, a partner returning, again and again, to negotiate his own exposure. He would have ruined me, Fenwick said at last, his voice hoarse. 25 years of work, of reputation, gone. Upon the strength of a signature, I paid a forger in Clerkenwell £4 to produce, when I was scarcely 30 years old, and desperate for a fortune I believed I had rightfully earned in every way but the paper trail. You believed it rightfully yours, Holmes observed, and yet you knew, well enough, that belief and honesty are not the same coin, or you should have gone to him openly all those years ago and made your case as one honest man to another, rather than purchasing a false signature to settle by fraud what you dared not settle by truth." Fenwick had no answer to this, and none, I think, that would have served him. And so, upon your final visit, when Pemberton informed you, I believe, that he had resolved to go to the Admiralty's board regardless of any payment you might offer, you struck him down with whatever instrument lay nearest to hand upon his own workbench, reset every clock in this chamber to the hour of 11 minutes past midnight to fix your alibi at your club, retrieved the forged document you had come, that final night, specifically to recover and destroy, bolted the door from within to manufacture the illusion of an impossible crime, and withdrew by the passage. None but yourself and the dead man knew existed. You then drugged young Croft's ale at a public house you had, I do not doubt, watched him frequent for some weeks prior, smeared a portion of Pemberton's blood, taken, I should imagine, upon a cloth you carried away from the scene for that express purpose, upon his cuff while he lay insensible, and left him to wake into a nightmare of suspicion precisely calculated to occupy Scotland Yard's full attention while your own guilt went unexamined. The room had fallen entirely silent, save for Fenwick's ragged breathing, and it was into that silence that he spoke his final words of confession, not, I think, from any repentance, but from the simple exhaustion of a man who understood, at last, that concealment had reached its absolute end. "I never meant for the boy to hang," he said quietly, "only to be doubted long enough that I might finish what I came to do. I am sorry for that much at least. Whatever else I am not sorry for." Lestrade, who had listened to the whole recitation with an expression passing gradually from scepticism through astonishment to grim satisfaction, stepped forward at last to place a hand upon Fenwick's shoulder and pronounce the words of formal arrest, his voice carrying, for once, none of its usual impatience, but only the solemn weight the occasion demanded. The false experts shed their disguise, and became, in the space of a moment, ordinary constables once more, and it was these same men who led Aldous Fenwick out through the front door of the shop he had so long avoided, into the cold night air of Regent Street, past the very lamp beneath which the chandler's boy had once glimpsed his half-recognised face. Chapter 16. The Full Account. In the days that followed Fenwick's arrest, as the particulars of the case made their way through the machinery of the law, Holmes furnished Lestrade, and, in a quieter and more informal setting at Baker Street, myself and Isabella Pemberton, with the fuller account of the reasoning that had carried him from a locked room to a solved murder. The clocks told me the room's supposed impossibility was itself a manufactured deception, he explained, settled comfortably in his chair with his pipe drawing well, for no natural violence stops every timepiece in a chamber at the identical instant. That told me our murderer required an alibi for a specific hour, which in turn told me he possessed an alibi to require. A man with no alibi at all has no reason to fix the time of death so precisely, since any hour serves him equally poorly. The witnesses across the street told me a visitor came and went by some route we had not yet located, for no man vanishes from a watched street without a door somewhere unwatched. Pemberton's own published habits of horology told me the staggered clocks were his signature, and their uniform stopping therefore a forger's error. For Fenwick, in his haste to manufacture an alibi, could not have known that a clockmaker's own workshop would betray, by its very orderliness, the hand of someone unfamiliar with its master's private habits. The patent office told me of the old dispute, and the drawings recovered from Fenwick's own strongbox, attacked, I believe, by an accomplice, or perhaps by Fenwick's own staged self-injury, to divert suspicion, though I confess I never fully resolved which, and Fenwick himself has declined to enlighten us on that particular point, told me the dispute concerned a shared invention of real value, precisely the sort of secret worth killing twice over to protect. Young Croft's drugged ale and the conveniently discovered blood told me a scapegoat had been prepared, with a patience that argued weeks, not hours, of planning. And a man who plans his victim's replacement so far in advance is a man who has lived with his crime, in some fashion, long before he commits it. As for the passage itself, I merely applied the oldest principle in my profession. When every ordinary means of entrance and exit has been eliminated, however improbable the remainder must be the truth. A workshop belonging to a master of intricate mechanism was the very last place I should have expected to find an ordinary door, and the very first place I should have expected to find an extraordinary one. Lestrade, seated somewhat stiffly in the chair nearest the fire, ventured at last a question that had plainly troubled him since the arrest. "And how did you know, Mr. Holmes, that Fenwick would take the bait of the false announcement, rather than simply fleeing the country the moment he suspected we were closing in?" "Because a man who has spent 25 years building a reputation upon a forgery does not surrender that reputation easily, Lestrade, even when flight might preserve his liberty. Fenwick's crime, from first to last, was a crime of pride quite as much as greed, and I judged, rightly as it happens, that pride would bring him back to Regent Street one final time rather than let a rival's name be cleared while his own remained, in his own estimation at least, unjustly obscured." "And the thread of woolen cloth?" I asked, recalling our hour spent within the passage. "The wear upon the brickwork? Small confirmations, Watson, gathered once my reasoning had already pointed me toward Fenwick, rather than evidence that pointed me toward him in the first instance. A detective who waits for such confirmations before forming any theory at all will generally find the trail cold long before he has gathered enough of them to satisfy a jury. One must reason first, from the few facts available, toward the likeliest explanation, and only then seek the further evidence that will either support or demolish it." Isabella Pemberton, who had listened to this recitation with tears standing openly in her eyes for the first time since we had known her, could only press Holmes's hand in silent gratitude, for words, in that moment, plainly failed her entirely. A failure I found, for my own part, entirely forgivable given the ordeal she had endured. Chapter 17. Aftermath. Nathaniel Croft was released within the day. The charges against him dissolved as swiftly as they had been assembled, and I had the satisfaction of witnessing, some weeks later, his marriage to Isabella Pemberton in a small ceremony that Holmes and I were honoured to attend. Though my friend, true to his nature, professed himself far more interested in the wedding breakfast's excellent claret than in the sentiment of the occasion, a pretence I did not entirely believe, having observed the unmistakable warmth with which he shook the young bridegroom's hand. Aldous Fenwick stood trial some months later at the Old Bailey, a proceeding I attended in company with Holmes upon 2 of its several days, and was convicted upon the fullest evidence, the passage itself, the forged assignment recovered at last from its hiding-place within the false clock case, the testimony of Mrs. Attridge and the chandler's boy, and, not least, his own confession, given freely once the weight of Holmes's reconstruction had convinced him that further denial served no purpose. The prosecuting counsel made considerable use, in his closing remarks, of the image of 100 silenced clocks bearing false witness to their master's death, a phrase the newspapers seized upon with predictable relish and repeated for weeks thereafter in connection with the affair. He was sentenced to hang, a sentence I record here without particular satisfaction, for there is little triumph to be found in the final ruin of a man whose crime, however monstrous its conclusion, began a quarter-century before, in nothing more sinister than a young man's desire to claim more credit than he had earned. The chronometer escapement itself, its true authorship now established beyond dispute by the very documents Fenwick had killed to suppress, was in due course credited jointly to the memory of Josiah Pemberton and to Aldous Fenwick both, an irony that Holmes remarked upon with some dryness, observing that even a forger's genuine contributions do not cease to be genuine merely because his methods of claiming them were not. a piece of philosophy I confess I found rather harder to swallow than my friend seemed to. Isabella and Nathaniel took over the Emporium together, and I am told it prospers still under their joint management. The great long-case clock with its secret passage sealed permanently, and its history known only to the small circle who had lived through the case, though Isabella confided to me, at the wedding breakfast, that she intended to keep the panel itself intact, unsealed but locked. As a reminder, she said, that even the rooms we believe we know completely may yet hold passages we have never troubled to look for. Lestrade, for his part, received no small measure of credit in the press for the arrest, a circumstance Holmes bore with his usual philosophical indifference to public recognition, remarking only that the inspector had earned it fairly enough by granting the week's patience upon which the entire resolution had depended, and that a man who trusts another's judgment against his own inclination deserves whatever laurels follow from having done so. Chapter 18. Outro. It was some weeks after the trial's conclusion, upon a grey November evening not unlike the one upon which the case had begun, that I found occasion to remark to Holmes how neatly the affair had resolved itself, and to offer him what praise I could for a piece of reasoning that had, in my estimation, ranked among his finest. "You give the matter more credit than it deserves, Watson," said he, though the faint curl at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. "A detective's reputation is built upon 100 such cases, and forgotten upon the 101st failure, should one ever come. I find it wiser to take satisfaction in the reasoning itself than in whatever applause follows it, for the reasoning alone remains mine, come what may of public opinion." He received the compliment with the particular mixture of modesty and quiet satisfaction that I had come to recognize as his genuine response to praise. He privately believed well earned, though he would never have admitted as much in so many words. "There is little enough credit in it, Watson," said he, knocking the ash from his pipe into the grate. "A murderer who stops every clock in a room to fix an hour has, in effect, confessed that the true hour matters to him more than the crime itself, and a man who cares more for his alibi than his victim is a man already half caught, requiring only patience to catch the other half." The true difficulty lay not in the reasoning, which was simple enough once the clocks had spoken, but in persuading Lestrade to grant me the week's patience the reasoning required to bear fruit. And patience, Watson, is a faculty considerably rarer in Scotland Yard than either courage or diligence, both of which that institution possesses in ample and admirable supply. You are generous to them. I am accurate about them, which amounts to the same courtesy in the end. He rose, crossing to the window to gaze out upon the fog-wrapped street below, much as he had gazed upon a similar street upon the morning this case began. There is, I think, a lesson in this affair beyond the mere mechanics of its solution, that a room may appear sealed against all possibility, and a case against all doubt, and yet both may conceal a passage the builder himself half forgot he had made. I find I am rather fonder of clocks than I was a fortnight ago, Watson, for I have learned from them that even the most precise of mechanisms will, sooner or later, betray the hand of whoever tampers with its workings, provided someone troubles to look closely enough, and to trust that the smallest discrepancy is never in truth so small as it first appears. I sat some while longer in my chair beside the fire, watching the smoke of my own pipe curl toward the ceiling, and reflecting upon the strange chain of circumstance that had carried an old grievance from a Clerkenwell workshop, through 25 years of silence, to its final reckoning in a passage behind a clockmaker's oldest and grandest timepiece. It seemed to me, as I turned the matter over, that Holmes had spoken truer than he perhaps intended in observing that even the most precise of mechanisms will, in time, betray the hand that tampers with it, for surely no mechanism is more precise, nor more ultimately unforgiving, than a conscience burdened with a secret it cannot bear to keep, and dares not confess. He said no more upon the matter that evening, reaching instead for his violin and drawing from it, as the fog thickened beyond our window, and the lamps of Baker Street burned low against the dark, a long and melancholy air that seemed, to my ear at least, to carry within it something of Josiah Pemberton's 100 silent clocks, and something, too, of the quiet satisfaction of a case well and truly closed. The end.